Akihiko Yoshida is the artist who laid the groundwork of the painted stylized game art of the Final Fantasy series. Without a doubt, Yoshida has left his mark on numerous other beloved IPs such as Bravely Default, Vagrant Story and the cult classic Nier games. But how do we spot his signature art style when he's always evolving? Let's face it, Yoshida's illustrations know no bounds. And yes, his style has been mistaken by many artists for other artists. One thing's for sure though, Akihiko Yoshida's depiction of sexy girls always hits the mark in my book. When we break down and analyze Akihiko Yoshida's art style, there are some recurring tropes in his character art that not only define his unique aesthetic, but also serve as a testament to his unparalleled creativity. Before we dive into this, let's acknowledge one of Yoshida's main strengths, his ability to seamlessly switch between styles. In any fantasy setting he tackles, he still manages to make the characters seem alive. During an interview, Yoshida said he likes to mix things up, experiment and explore style with every new IP he's working on. Despite this, companies often hire him for what has become known as the Akihiko style. And to quote him on this, "In order to be different from others, you need to increase the number of artworks and styles that you look at, and try to find something special that no one else has ever found." And while I couldn't agree more, in this regard he reminds me of another Final Fantasy artist, Yoshitaka Amano. That said, the biggest takeaway of Akihiko Yoshida's character art are the eyes. No matter the realism level, they are very recognizable and striking. When we zoom in, characters often appear very gentle. This is because he emphasizes the upper eyelids with a thick curving line. This technique also adds the effect of expressing whimpers. Another aspect is his tendency to draw the irises rather large, contributing further to the soft appearance of his characters. Moreover, the lower part of the eyelids and tear ducts are seldom present. Lastly, thin eyebrow shapes are pervading preference in his designs overall. When we look at the face, in my eyes, Yoshida tends to soften the cheeks. Fair enough, this does not count for all characters and IPs, but he has his own way of curving them, slightly chubby, reminding me of an onion. Okay, that was a lame reference, but let me put it this way. When I examine his character art style, the eyes and cheeks are the first features that stand out to me. As for other features, such as the nose, their presence varies depending on the game art style Yoshida is working on. For instance, in games like Final Fantasy Tactics and Bravely Default, noses may not even be present, whereas in more realistic styles like in Final Fantasy XII and XIV, they are. Do note, it also depends on the distance how much detail of the nose he reveals. In case of the mouth, it also depends on the realism level. As far as I can tell, there's no one way that suits all his works. However, this neutral expression is very common in Yoshida's concept art, where he draws the mouth tiny and the eyes with the spaced out gaze, thinking about the meaning of life. When we check the hair, well, he does all kinds of hairstyles. However, most of the time he tends to favor realism. In simple terms, he draws the hair without anti-gravity physics in the majority of his characters. Okay, except for Ashley Riot, but in all honesty, he's so awesome it just suits him. It might be me, but one thing I notice in most of Yoshida's works is that he's really into legs, or at least find them very important. He tends to draw large thighs with strong leg calves. Furthermore, the legs are often depicted as long in proportion to the upper body. Also, more often than not, they are clearly visible. Especially the women are drawn in a cute and attractive way. In this regard, given Yoshida's talents, the art director's decision during the character development of Agnes to portray a sexy girl was definitely the right one. And believe it or not, he's quite gentle with the cup size of the females. Yes, this is a thing I notice while looking through his art. He never goes for the typical anime size. You know the one. To put it in another way, He keeps him in balance with the body proportion. Maybe that's also why the legs are more emphasized. But I don't know, I'll leave the details to your imagination. Anyways, if you think I'm exaggerating on these points, Akihiko Yoshida said in an interview, "When I get stuck with character design, I start with the buttocks and go from there." You heard that right. He noted that he doesn't know how this specific creative process works, but he added that his mind starts to flow from the backside of a character. Like you've noticed, he uses a lot of different media, no question about that. However, he does tend to favor the painted style. Be it through media like oil paint or wet wash, watercolor and even digital art. No matter what kind of media he uses. In most of his IPs, he creates some sort of painted promotional illustration. For these types of works, he uses soft brush strokes combined with low saturated colors. And like most painters, Yoshida is excellent at contrast. In an interview he mentioned that all painters like Rembrandt, Millet, and of course manga legends like Katsuhiro Otomo inspired his style. To simplify, Akihiko Yoshida has three main art styles: chibi, semi-realism, and his very personal stylistic art. Without a doubt, all of them contain his aesthetic, and aside from the tropes I already mentioned, to really clarify the aspects what makes him, him, we first need to look at his concept art. Yoshida's line art is sketchy, and employs hatching techniques to not only create volume and shade, but also to add shape and direction. He strategically maintains space between the strokes, a technique evident in his painting works as well. Also, his concept art of Bravely Default revealed that he was involved in story and scenery panels. And he's good at it, because fun fact, he started out as a background artist in games. And why is this important? Well, technically he's a character designer. Promotional art and scenery art are not always included. But when Yoshida does add them, he shows the full extent of his artistic talent. He excels at setting the scene for characters and bringing them to life. If you ask me, Yoshida thrives in war settings, and it's no wonder tactical RPG game director Yasumi Matsuno asked him to join the club. And to add a small shoutout on top, Yoshida also worked on a lot of projects with the genius composer Hitoshi Sakimoto, who did many of the excellent music scores. The art, the setting and music go hand in hand if you ask me. But enough about personal opinion. My question to you is, which one of these are drawn by Akihiko Yoshida? Well, none of them are. These were drawn by Naoki Ikushima, the artist of Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy. And while the artist could fool anyone to draw like Yoshida's chibi style, again, one of the biggest reveal is how Yoshida does the hatching. One important thing though, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are many artist illustrations that are mistaken to be Yoshida's, like this one from Yusuke Mogi, or this one from Kazuya Takahashi, and even this one from Tsubasa Masao. This is because Yoshida was one of the pioneers to popularize such a realistic painted manga style into mainstream games. However, just for fun, let's turn up another notch. Which of these Final Fantasy Tactics art pieces are from Akihiko Yoshida? It's this one. Yoshida was the character art supervisor of Roji Ohara, who did Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. They both did promotional illustrations of the Tactics event. One of the biggest differences between them is how they draw the eyes. In case of Ohara, he likes to add catch lights in the center of the pupil. Additionally, Yoshida often depicts characters from the rear, a less common angle in character art. That said, he really loves to emphasize the pose, be it cute, gentle or strong. The silhouettes are always interesting and smooth in some way. He has an eye for composition, making each character important, but still keeping the focal point to the center. Besides that, Yoshida initially worked on cutesy characters, but when objectively discussing character designs, it's evident that he has a knack for more mature characters. Even in games like Bravely Default, his non-chibi style looks great. However, when we focus solely on character design, I don't find them particularly outstanding in terms of being visually striking or memorable. Okay, except for the main characters of Nier and Vagrant Story. And while I do agree that Ramza and maybe Anyas are memorable as well, I just think Tetsuya Nomura and Amano's designs hit the mark more often, if you know what I mean. Okay, I might sound negative, but that's not the point I want to make. What I think Akihiko Yoshida does exceptionally well is that he knows how to make distinctive characters. Show their personality without screaming the typical stereotype. What I mean is, the OG Bravely Default gang visually tell their personality without being that obvious. Also, the Final Fantasy XII characters are a bunch of interesting individuals of different ages and backgrounds. Akihiko Yoshida puts a lot of care in designing character costumes, which is understandable considering many of the games he works on involve a job system. While the clothing designs are often simplistic, they suit the setting perfectly. In some cases he even went over the top, getting inspired by mountain gear combined with knight armors. Speaking of Final Fantasy XII, he wanted to design unique gear that had never been seen before in any culture. I believe Yoshida did some monster art, well, chocobos don't count, and in a Vagrant Story developer interview he said he wasn't a reader of sword and sorcery fantasy novels, thus he just went with the flow by designing creatures in his own way. With all that said, to quote him, "Just because you're a video game designer, that doesn't mean you only should look at video game art. Therefore, I used to look at other artworks and paintings with great attention. This makes perfect sense to me, as many game artists that I already covered mention that they get inspired from classical painters, manga, anime, western comics, and even movies." I'm light novel author GP Phillips, and the first time my brother borrowed Vagrant Story from a friend, the cover art was mesmerizing. Later on, I began to recognize Yoshida's work more and more, and I fell in love with it. In my eyes, he's underrated, because most of the projects he has worked on are not mainstream. But still, he's one of the best.